Welcome to Libeth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in Heian, Japan, with the Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu, Lady-in-Waiting. Think of Genji less as a sequence of events and more as a machine for making absence visible. A civilization written in silk and incense that shows you how beauty, ceremony, and petty favor can turn into their opposite. The book opens not with a duel or a law code, but with a lady favored so much that her rise becomes a slow, surgical undoing. She grows thin under envy and dies, while the emperor, absorbed in private tenderness, lets state business slide. That pattern, elevation followed by exclusion, affection followed by ruin, is not a moral anecdote the author tucks away for a last line. It is the operating principle of the court she watches, and she makes us live inside it. Seen this way, every graceful poem or exquisitely folded robe becomes a lever in a system that manufactures loneliness. The first thing Genji teaches you is how refinement functions as pressure. More importantly, the text locates power where we are least inclined to look for it, in the choreography of attention. The emperor's tenderness to the Kiritsubo lady is political, not purely sentimental. Keeping her near him changes alliances, stirs old rivalries, and sends courtiers whispering about Yang Kui-fei and riots overseas. Genji himself is raised, then named Minamoto, then paraded and ritually clothed at his initiation with elaborate gifts of hawks and horses. These ceremonial acts are not incidental color, they are the state's currency. Power in the Tale of Genji speaks in verses and moves behind screens. It is exercised through seating, through who sees whom at dusk, through the placement of a child at the imperial side. The point Murasaki insists upon is that where direct speech would destabilize hierarchy, artifice, and aesthetics, step in to manage relations. And those substitutions of language for blunt force become the very grammar of governance. What appears to be ornamentation is in fact administration. And this confusion between decoration and control is the book's first and most persistent trap for the reader who comes expecting story. But this creates a particular kind of voice and mood. The novel's tone is never simply elegiac or celebratory. It lives in both. Murasaki writes with the quiet of someone who has measured the cost of every compliment and knows the kernel of violence in every compliment's shadow. Witness the emperor who, in private, weeps over the dead favorite and in public is reproached for negligence. Witness the way courtiers exchange poems about wind and moonlight, while a child's fate hangs between competing factions. That double register, lament and festival, is how the book keeps you off balance, so that admiration for a face or a dance becomes simultaneously an account and an accusation. You are invited to feel beauty's pull, and then to watch how that pull is put to use. The novel never lets these two registers separate cleanly. The banquet and the funeral share a grammar, and Murasaki's prose refuses to distinguish them because the court itself refuses that distinction. To celebrate and to mourn simultaneously is not confusion, but competence. It is the skill the court demands of everyone who wishes to survive inside it. As a consequence, identity in the world Murasaki describes is not interior truth, but social performance. Genji is a man whose name changes like a costume. The emperor's son, Hikaru Genji the Shining One, later Minamoto by adoption, always an assemblage of honors and garments. His identity takes shape in the girding of the purple fillet at his initiation, in the ritual of putting on the trousers, in the poets who address him with oblique allusions. The novel shows, again and again, that who you are depends on who looks and what they put into the look. Fujitsubo's resemblance to Kiritsubo is not merely an uncanny echo. It becomes a structural hinge that rearranges alliances and produces catastrophe. Identity, here, is recognition turned into politics. This means that the self is never safely located inside one person. It is distributed across the eyes of every observer, and when those observers shift their gaze, when the emperor ages, when a faction rises, when a child's birth rewrites succession, the self that was built in the glow of their attention becomes suddenly unstable. Genji is not simply a man who matters to many people. He is a man whose mattering is what makes him a person at all. Consequently, emotion becomes a navigational tool more than a raw confession. Lovers do not simply declare themselves. They compose, they send fans and poems, they trade little gifts that encode degrees of favor and obligation. The book is full of conversations conducted through folded papers and half-placed fans, because to name feeling outright would topple hierarchies. To no Chujo and Uma no Kami talk about women as if they were works of art to be judged for endurance as much as for charm. Their stories about jealousy and forbearance are less private gossip than manuals for operating within the etiquette. The novel makes clear that emotional dexterity, the art of hinting, of withholding, of calculating when to display sorrow, is how people survive inside a system that punishes bluntness. Where speech would rupture order, feeling disguised as art preserves it. The consequence is that no emotion in the book arrives unprocessed. Every grief has been filtered through the correct poetic register, every desire translated into the approved season and time of day before it is communicated. This processing does not make the emotions false. Murasaki insists they are real, but it does mean they can never be simply received. They must always be read, interpreted, weighted against the possibility of misdirection or tactical display. To feel in this world is to perform, and to perform is to compete. Romance in Genji therefore functions as governance. It arranges kinship, it clarifies succession, it reconfigures patronage. The emperor's longing for Kiritsubo's child, the furtive tenderness toward Fujitsubo, the politics around the heir apparent, all these are not romance in the sentimental sense, but instruments for shaping power. A love affair can be a policy, a gift can be a subsidy, a whisper can be a treaty. Even the choice to make a child a Minamoto, a maneuver Genji suffers as both boon and instrument, is less about sentiment than strategic placement. In the tale, who initiates a liaison and who suffers its fallout are coordinates on a political map. This is why the book's intimate scenes, the stolen glance through a screen, the poem wrapped around a branch and left at a threshold, carry weight beyond their delicacy. They are gestures by which the court's architecture shifts. Every quiet meeting in the small hours rearranges something in the formal structure of the day. Romance and statecraft are not parallel activities here. They are the same activity conducted in different registers. Seen as consequence, beauty becomes both currency and corruption. The child's face at the presentation in the palace is a political asset. The emperor's lavish offerings to the Shining One provoke envy and rumor. At the Festival of Red Leaves, Genji's dance of the blue waves lifts him almost into the supernatural, and yet that same beauty makes him a target, a crown of attention that damages as much as it affords. Murasaki refuses to let us hold admiration and moral judgment apart. The very splendor that confers legitimacy also abrades it. Ornament and honor are porous. And the novel uses this permeability to show how a system that bases value on appearance will source its own decline. Beauty's instability is not incidental to the court's power structure. It is constitutive of that structure. Because beauty is the primary form of value, and because beauty cannot be possessed permanently, the entire value system of the court is organized around something that will not hold still. That is not an accident. It is an architecture of chronic anxiety. Seen this way, the court's aesthetic perfection is not a cultural triumph, but a pressure system that compensates for political fragility. The more polite the etiquette, the more brittle the polity beneath it. The Kiritsubo episode makes that clear. A low-ranked woman elevated by devotion becomes vulnerable because there is no institutional cushion of power available to protect a favorite of insufficient rank. The emperor's private vow to keep her by his side reads in the world as dereliction of duty. Rituals, promotions read at a bier, 7 weeks of mourning observed with exactitude, the precise ordering of an initiation, are the state's substitute for an effective political balance. All the finery performs a function. It keeps fear from becoming overt rebellion. It channels danger into elegy. The court survives by keeping its most explosive pressures in aesthetic containers, by converting grievance into verse and anger into season. And that conversion is not hypocrisy, but engineering. The court needs its elaborate surfaces, precisely because the ground beneath them is uncertain. In consequence, Murasaki's choice of language is itself an act of politics. She writes in kana, the script the men of power had considered feminine, the gentle speech dismissed by officials schooled in Chinese. And in that choice, the novel becomes female observation turned unofficial political analysis. The ladies of the wardrobe are the eyes and ears of the palace. Their gossip is detailed record-keeping. Their moments of interior thought reveal power lines that Latinized histories miss. The everlasting wrong and Teiji no in are read aloud in Yamato's speech. The emperor and his circle quote Chinese poets, yet it is the women's speech that accumulates the social truth of daily life. Writing in kana is not a mere stylistic tilt. It is a tactical voice that lets Murasaki map the soft infrastructure of rule. This choice also has a structural consequence for how the book works on the reader. Because we are receiving the court's politics through what was considered a minor, domestic, feminine mode of record, we are positioned to see precisely what the official histories could not acknowledge. That power passes not through the offices men held in public, but through the rooms where women waited, and that the real decisions of the Heian court were made in the language of fans and perfume and carefully timed visits. But this very attentiveness intensifies suffering. The court's acute sensitivity, the fine-tuned taste, the ear for a poem placed at the wrong hour, produces not wisdom but pain. When a line is misread, when a fan is exchanged in the wrong light, the consequences can be fatal. Yugao's death in the outer quarter, taken in with a simple fan and a furtive night visit, shows how a private encounter that seems transient can cascade into ruin. Rokujo's latent jealousy, translated through dream and ritual, reaches into Ai's bed and leaves ruin in its wake. Unlike the sweeping violence of armies or courts, this is a slow violence, distributed across layers of etiquette, and the novel holds the microscope to each micro-injury until you see the whole society's nervous system. The court's exquisite sensitivity is not protective. It is the mechanism by which injury is transmitted with maximum fidelity. The same nervous system that allows a poem to function as a love declaration also allows a slight to function as a wound that will not close. As a result, the Tale of Genji is less an assembly of characters than a study of how systems reproduce emotional damage. Make beauty the coin of value, make conversation indirect to protect rank, and you create a world where grief is a social instrument and loneliness a predictable side effect. The emperor's prolonged seclusion after Kiritsubo's death reveals that an absence of public conflict can itself be evidence of repression. The court replaces open struggle with ritualized feeling. As a consequence, emotional life becomes the theater where political tensions play out, and the performances never quite end. This is the mechanism at the center of the book. The court converts every form of social conflict into aesthetic experience. Rivalry becomes competitive poetry. Anger becomes spirit possession. Grief becomes months of exquisitely observed mourning. And that conversion does not resolve the conflict. It relocates it, preserves it in beautiful form, where it continues to do its work long after the occasion that produced it has passed. This is why, in reading Genji, I ask you to look not for a tidy plot, but for accumulation of pressure. Every scene, the boy placed at the emperor's throat, the fan slipped under a curtain, the poem sent at dawn, is one more instance of a system compressing itself tighter. Over time, the small acts of concealment, the economy of hints, the ever more refined etiquettes build toward consequences that are structural rather than merely personal. A court that exhausts itself on beauty because it has no other effective instruments of power. We are watching a civilization study the terms of its own exhaustion as it advances. Each episode we encounter is a small experiment. What happens when one more unit of pressure is applied to a system already strained? And the answer the novel returns, again and again with patient precision, is that the system does not break cleanly. It deforms. It produces new arrangements of damage. It finds subtler and more beautiful ways to contain what it cannot resolve. And yet there are 5 currents that will keep returning as you listen. Loneliness inside privilege, identity as social performance, emotion used as navigation, romance functioning as governance, beauty serving as currency and corruption. I name them plainly because they are not discrete themes to be checked off but structural effects of one another. Privilege produces loneliness because recognition becomes the only sustaining thing. Performance produces identity because rank requires theater. Navigation-centered emotions keep hierarchies intact. Romance rearranges power. Beauty buys legitimacy and corrodes it. Each of these is planted by Murasaki as a consequence of court form, not as an individual failing of Genji or any other figure. Genji is not a villain, and that is the whole point. He is an ideal subject of a system that produces villainous outcomes through its very idealism. Seen this way, the novel's episodes stop feeling like isolated tragedies and start feeling like experiments in social engineering. The Kiritsubo ladies decline tests what happens when private favor outruns public backing. Yugao's vanishing tests how secrecy and exposure conversely destroy one another. The scene with Fujitsubo reframes resemblance as a political accelerant. Rokujo's withdrawal and AI's collapse test the limits of envy, ritual, and the body as the site of public meaning. The rescue of such episodes is that they do not resolve. They expose mechanics. Each moment peels back a layer, and the logic beneath becomes visible because the human scale is never lost. These are people, not allegories, and that is why the machines of etiquette and power in the book feel so inexorable. The novel's specific genius is to make its structural argument through scenes so intimate that you forget you are watching a structure. Only later, in the accumulation of episodes, does the pattern become undeniable. So our way into this 1,000-year-old text will be anchored in reading, not as passive consumption, but as an act of accumulation. When we read the Kiritsubo chapter aloud, when we let the emperor call her by 100 pretty names and then linger over the hush that follows her decline, we are not merely savoring style, we are watching the pressure rise. When we sit with the trembling exchange of poems in the night at Utsusemi's house, we are seeing how direct speech would have demolished a hierarchy, and so how language corrals desire into forms that preserve rank. Each block of our listening will return us to a passage that holds the grammar of the whole, an immaculately furnished moment that explains why the court both survives and corrodes. What we are after is not the pleasure of the story, though that pleasure is real, and Murasaki is a magnificent writer, but something harder and more useful, an understanding of how a civilization organizes itself around its own fragility. The court does not merely suffer its contradictions, it cultivates them. It makes them beautiful, it names them with the right seasonal references, and it teaches generation after generation to experience the contradictions as refinement rather than as the structural fault lines they actually are. Murasaki shows us that process from within, which means she shows us how much work it takes to sustain the beautiful surface, and how the very effort of that sustaining is what eventually exhausts the civilization that undertakes it. Which is to say, finally, that the Tale of Genji resolves nothing in the moral sense. It refuses the consolations of tidy endings. It does not fix culpability, and it does not offer redemption as a neat bow. What it does is far more interesting. It reveals patterns of how zero-sum attentions are parceled out, how small social economies calcify into institutions, how aesthetic excellence turns, with lethal inevitability, into an index of fragility. The book leaves you with an awareness that ritual and beauty can sustain a polity for a time, and at the same time, erode its substance from within. This is not a warning issued from a safe distance. Murasaki is writing from inside the polity. She is one of its women. She speaks in its language and inhabits its rooms, and the analysis she performs is therefore all the more remarkable for being conducted from within the very system it anatomizes. She does not stand apart from the court and judge it. She sits behind its screens and describes, with extraordinary precision, how it destroys the people it loves. Knowing that is not comfort. It is a kind of precision, and Murasaki gives it to us without apology. That's all for today on Libeth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, one new book every week. At least we try.